The wind crawled through the alleys of Fairhaven like a forgotten whisper, dragging with it dry leaves and the scent of last week's rain. On the far edge of the town square, where tourists rarely wandered and the Christmas lights had long been taken down, a man sat hunched beneath the rusted skeleton of a bus shelter. His coat, an old military issue from another era, hung heavy over his shoulders, the once proud insignia now faded into anonymity. His name was Samuel Hayes. He was 67 years old and had no address. To the casual passerby, he might have looked like any other homeless man, grizzled, hollow-eyed, holding a paper cup with a reluctant hand that trembled more from cold than age. But there was a way he looked at the world, slow, observant, like someone trained to scan for snipers, that hinted at a past far more disciplined than his present suggested. He never asked for money. That was a matter of principle, and principles were all he had left. In his pocket, Samuel carried a small laminated photograph of a woman with soft eyes and a tired smile, Caroline. She had been his wife for 35 years and his lifeline after war. Cancer had taken her 2 winters ago, but the real wound had come from the system that failed her. The hospital for veterans had misdiagnosed her symptoms 3 times, and by the time someone bothered to run the right tests, she had 6 weeks to live. Samuel had sold everything: the house, the old Jeep, Caroline's wedding ring. Every cent had gone to the animal shelter she used to volunteer at her last request. After that, there was nothing left to tie him to the life they had built. He could have moved in with his son, but Samuel had never told him the truth about how bad things had gotten. Pride was an anchor he refused to cut. He chose instead to disappear, to blend into the shadows of the country he once bled for. There was something ironically peaceful about vanishing. No bills, no appointments, no more reminders of what he'd lost. Only the ache in his knees and the constant dialogue in his head, where Caroline still lived. The people of Fairhaven were neither cruel nor kind. They were busy. Occasionally, someone left a coffee near his bench, or a pair of gloves, and Samuel accepted these anonymous kindnesses with a nod to no one in particular. He spent his mornings collecting aluminum cans by the riverbank, his afternoons reading weathered paperbacks he found in the library's donation bin. At night, he burrowed beneath the bus shelter, wrapping himself in silence. He avoided the shelters, too noisy, too crowded, too full of ghosts. The streets were hard, but they were honest, and honesty mattered. He didn't drink, didn't touch drugs. He survived on peanut butter sandwiches from the local church and the steady discipline of a soldier still stuck in a mission he couldn't define. Some nights he dreamed of Iraq, of the sandstorms and burning tires, of orders shouted over static radios. Other nights he dreamed of his front porch in New Hampshire, where Caroline used to drink chamomile tea and read mystery novels until dusk. There were moments when Samuel thought about the absurdity of it all, how a man with medals tucked away in a tin box somewhere could end up forgotten, not by enemies, but by the very nation he'd served. There was no bitterness, only a kind of exhausted confusion. It wasn't betrayal that hurt, it was the silence. The sense that after a certain age, or after a certain tragedy, the world simply stopped seeing you. And so Samuel Hayes sat, invisible but intact, worn thin by time, yet unbroken in spirit. He wasn't waiting for a miracle. He wasn't even waiting for death. He was simply enduring, a quiet protest against a world that had moved on without him. It had been 3 days since Samuel Hayes had eaten anything solid. The last sandwich from the church pantry had gone stale in his coat pocket before he could finish it. He'd rationed it anyway, half on the first day, a quarter on the second, and the last crust gnawed in the early hours of a cold, sleepless morning when the ache in his gut had grown louder than the wind. Hunger was no longer a sensation. It was a companion, pressing against his ribs like a second skin. He tried to keep his dignity intact. He knew all the subtle tricks: the bakery that threw out unsold pastries at 7, the deli that sometimes left a sandwich too close to the garbage. But luck, like everything else, had started turning its back. And pride, even weathered and bent, had limits when it came to starvation. That morning, the streets of Fairhaven were quieter than usual. The town square was washed in gray light, the kind that softened everything and made the world look half asleep. Samuel's hands were shaking more than usual. He had sat on the bench outside Belle's grocery store for almost an hour, pretending to tie his boot, pretending to read an old map he didn't need anymore. But mostly he was watching. Not the people, though he did that too, but the pattern. The rhythm of the automatic doors. The bored expressions of the cashiers. The location of the blind spot between the camera and the corner rack. He hadn't stolen a thing since he was 12 years old and hungry in foster care. That memory had clawed its way back to him now, not just the act of stealing, but the shame that came with it, the red flush on his cheeks, the way the store manager had looked at him like he was less than human. Samuel remembered swearing that day he'd never let himself become that boy again. But survival rewrites promises. When he finally moved, it wasn't a decision, it was instinct. His body simply stood up and walked inside. He kept his shoulders straight, his head low. He drifted past the rows of apples and cereal boxes like a ghost, the kind no one noticed until the shelves were emptier. He grabbed a protein bar and a small pack of turkey slices, nothing extravagant, nothing he couldn't eat fast. Then, in a moment of irrational, almost childlike impulse, he took a granola bar shaped like a Christmas tree. It reminded him of Caroline. She used to buy them for the neighbors' kids. His hands were swift, practiced by a lifetime of careful movements. He tucked the food under his coat, just beneath the fold of his arm where the fabric sagged. He thought he was clear, almost out the door. But then the sound came, sharp, mechanical, and cold.
A click.
Then a voice.
Sir.
You want to turn around and show me what's in your coat? The security guard wasn't young, but he was taller, built like someone who hadn't missed a meal in years. Samuel's stomach betrayed him with a loud, humiliating growl, and for a second, neither of them spoke. The guard didn't raise his voice, didn't even seem angry. He just looked tired, like a man who'd had to do this too many times before. Samuel didn't argue. He simply took the food out of his coat and handed it over like it was a confession. His eyes didn't plead. They simply asked for it to be over quickly. The manager was called. A woman in her 40s with lipstick too bright for the setting and a voice sharp enough to pierce concrete. She asked the questions like a checklist. Had he done this before? Was he homeless? Why hadn't he gone to the shelter? Samuel said nothing until she asked if he wanted to press charges against himself. The absurdity made him chuckle just once. It was the only sound he'd made since entering the store. The police weren't called. Not this time. Maybe because the manager pitied him, or maybe because she recognized something in his eyes, something old and broken, but not dangerous. She let him go with a warning and a paper bag with a protein bar still inside. Said it was a gesture. Samuel hated that word. Gestures were what people gave instead of real help. But he took it. Back outside, he sat on the same bench as before. The food tasted dry in his mouth, but it filled the hole in his stomach just enough to remind him how empty he had felt. He didn't cry. He hadn't in years. But for a few minutes, he let himself feel the shame again, like the boy in the foster home who'd stolen an orange and gotten slapped for it. He whispered Caroline's name under his breath. It wasn't a prayer. It was a memory, a tether to who he used to be. He thought of what she would have said, softly disapproving, gently firm. She would have told him to ask someone next time. But she would have understood. As the sky turned pale blue and the town stirred awake around him, Samuel Hayes closed his eyes and listened to the low hum of morning traffic. He had survived another night, another day, but something inside him had shifted, a crack in the armor. Hunger was no longer just physical. It had begun to eat at his identity, too. 3 weeks had passed since Samuel Hayes was caught shoplifting. He had hoped the incident would fade into the quiet folds of the town's forgetfulness. But Fairhaven had a long memory for small crimes, especially when committed by those already fallen from grace. A citation had arrived in the mail of the shelter where he sometimes slept. A court date stamped in block letters. He didn't even have a watch to mark the passing of hours anymore, yet now his life ticked toward a judgment that seemed both inevitable and absurd. The courtroom was small, almost intimate. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The benches smelled of aged wood and cleaner. Samuel sat at the front, alone, hands folded, eyes hollow but not defiant. He wore a second-hand blazer donated by a church charity, the sleeves too short, the shoulders seams too tight. He looked like a man trying to remember what dignity felt like, wearing it like an old uniform that no longer fit. The charge was petty theft, a misdemeanor. In another life, it might have been laughable. In this one, it was a mirror held up to the slow erosion of his identity. The prosecution didn't waste time. A clean-cut young attorney read the facts with clinical detachment: items stolen, store policies violated, the incident logged on security footage. No embellishment, no venom. Just words that cut with their indifference. Then it was his turn. The judge, a woman in her 60s with silver hair pinned tightly back and glasses resting low on her nose, looked at him for a long moment. Her voice was gentle but not soft. "Mr. Hayes, would you like to say anything on your behalf?" Samuel stood. He didn't read from a note. He had nothing prepared. He simply let the silence speak first, and then his voice followed, cracked and low, like an engine turning over after years of disuse. "I was hungry," he said. "That's not a defense. I know that, but it's the truth. I didn't plan it like a crime. I planned it like survival. I didn't want to hurt anyone. I used to have a job, a home, a wife. I used to know who I was. But life, sometimes it thins you out, like water over stone. And one day, you look around and realize you've worn away more than you've kept." He didn't beg. He didn't excuse. He didn't offer a tragic backstory or play the sympathy card. He just told the truth in a voice that no longer knew how to lie. There was a stillness in the room when he finished, the kind that doesn't come from awe, but from recognition. Some part of his fatigue had made its way into the walls. The judge didn't sentence him that day. She asked him to stay back after the hearing. In her chambers, the atmosphere shifted. It was no longer law, but something more personal. She told him she remembered his name, Samuel Hayes, the city planner who once helped redesign Fairhaven's public library. Her son had studied in that library. He'd loved the reading alcove Samuel had insisted on adding, the one with the skylight and beanbags for children. She hadn't connected the dots until now. She asked what had happened. He hesitated at first, but the dam was already leaking. He told her about Caroline, the illness, the slow death, the savings drained on treatments that didn't work, the house sold, the job gone, the months that turned into years, the years that turned him into someone he didn't recognize. And then something unexpected happened. She said, "I can't undo what life has done to you, but I can keep it from crushing you any further." Instead of jail time or fines he couldn't pay, she ordered community service, 20 hours a week at the public library he helped design, now barely staffed due to budget cuts. "You built it," she said. "Now help keep it alive." It was the first real thread Samuel had been offered in years. Something that felt like purpose, not pity. He didn't know what to say. So he nodded. It was all he had. When he walked out of the courthouse that day, the air felt different. Not warm, not kind, but clear, sharp, like something had shifted in the atmosphere around him. For the first time in a long while, the weight on his shoulders felt shared, not lifted, not gone, but recognized. He passed a child on the courthouse steps eating a granola bar shaped like a Christmas tree. The sight made him smile, small, brief, but real. The kind of smile Caroline used to trace with her fingers in the morning light when she thought he was still asleep. Samuel Hayes didn't believe in second chances, but he believed in movement. And now, however slowly, he was moving again. The library smelled the same. That was the first thing Samuel Hayes noticed when he pushed open the glass door. The scent of old pages and dust clinging to wood. Nostalgia, memory, and quiet resignation, all braided into the air. He stood there for a moment, just beyond the threshold, as if the building itself was deciding whether to accept him again. The sunlight streamed in through the very skylight he had once insisted be added, a beam of reluctant warmth across the tiled floor. No one recognized him. It wasn't surprising. Time is not just a thief, it's a sculptor, reshaping faces, shoulders, voices, turning once commanding presences into silent strangers. The young librarian behind the counter glanced at him briefly before returning to her computer screen, her expression neither rude nor warm. Just tired. Distracted. He could have been anyone. A drifter. A maintenance man. Certainly not the architect of the space in which she now worked. Samuel moved quietly, the way one does in sacred places. Every shelf he passed was like a familiar face whose name he couldn't quite recall. Here was the reading corner he had designed to catch the morning light. There, the alcove with rounded walls so children could curl up like foxes in a den and read stories about dragons. That curve in the staircase, he remembered fighting for it, insisting it invite curiosity, not efficiency. And the second-floor windows. He had once stood beside Caroline, pointing to blueprints with a kind of childish pride, explaining how natural light could change everything. But now the windows were smudged. The reading nook was empty. A beanbag chair had split, and no one had bothered to sweep up the white stuffing spilling like snow across the carpet. The staircase creaked. A silence hung in the air, not the sacred kind, but the forgotten kind, hollow, purposeless. He spent his first hours shelving books, his fingers tracing the spines like artifacts from another life. Titles he once loved now stirred only a vague echo. He caught his reflection in the glass of a display case, gray hair curling at his neck, jaw more angular, eyes tired in that deep, permanent way grief carves into the soul. This was the face of the man who had once presented grand visions at city council meetings, who had spoken of community spaces with fire in his chest and renderings rolled up under his arm like a warrior with blueprints instead of swords. Now he carried books. He didn't resent it. That would have required energy. But there was something quietly devastating about being a guest in the house he'd built. A relic among relics. It wasn't that people had stolen his legacy. It was that no one remembered there was one to steal. A group of children came in later that afternoon. A school trip, perhaps. Their laughter rang through the halls, light and sharp. Samuel watched them from behind a row of biographies. They tumbled into the reading alcove with the same joy he had once imagined. And yet none of them would ever know his name. They'd never know that the curved ceiling above them had been designed to soften sound and hold warmth in winter. That the little hidden shelf by the window was placed there because Caroline once said every child deserved a secret place to read. He sank into a chair in the back corner as the day waned. The ache in his knees was sharper than usual. His body reminded him of his age more insistently now, as if it, too, were eager to distance itself from who he used to be. It wasn't self-pity that filled him. It was something colder. The realization that legacy, real legacy, isn't marble statues or named plaques. It is breath, memory. And when the people who remember you stop breathing, your name slips into the cracks between the floorboards. He thought of Caroline again. How she'd held his face once and said, "You build beautiful things, Sam, but you don't know how to be one." Maybe she was right. At closing, he helped stack chairs. The librarian thanked him mechanically, eyes already on the next task. He walked out into the dusk alone, the library lights behind him flickering off one by one, like stars surrendering to the night. He didn't look back. There was nothing there to look at, nothing that still saw him. It began with an envelope. Cream-colored, slightly wrinkled at the edges, and tucked beneath a stack of overdue notices on the library's front desk. Samuel almost missed it, nearly tossing it aside as junk, until he saw his name. Not just Mr. Hayes, or to the janitor, but Samuel Hayes, written in a looping hand that didn't belong to any of the staff. There was something deliberate in the way the ink curled, as if the sender had taken their time, had wanted this to be seen. Opened. Read. He waited until his shift was done before tearing the flap open with a finger gone coarse from scrubbing, dusting, mopping. The letter inside was handwritten, 2 full pages on lined paper that had once been folded into a notebook. No return address. No signature at the top. Just words. Careful, fragile words. Dear Mr. Hayes, you probably don't remember me, but I remember you. I was 8 years old when you came to our school with blueprints rolled under your arm and eyes that lit up when you talked about light and space, and how buildings can breathe like people. You walked us through the first model of the new library. I sat in the front row, scribbling your name on the margins of my notebook because it sounded like it belonged to someone important. And when you showed us the design for the children's alcove, do you remember you said you wanted it to feel like a hug made of sunlight? That's what stayed with me. Samuel read those lines with hands that trembled slightly, not from age, but from something deeper. A recognition that crept slowly up the spine and settled behind the eyes like unexpected rain. I used to come to this library every day after school. My parents were fighting a lot back then. It was the only quiet place I knew. That little nook, your nook, was where I read every book I could find about astronomy. I ended up studying architecture, partly because of that day you visited. I graduate this spring, and every project I design, I ask myself, would this feel like a hug made of sunlight? Thank you. I just wanted you to know that you were seen. There was no name at the bottom, just a small sketch of a sun peeking over an open book. Samuel didn't cry. Not quite. But he sat for a long time at the edge of the maintenance closet, the letter resting like scripture on his lap. He reread it 3 times, each word carving itself more deeply into the hollowed spaces he hadn't realized were still soft. He had not been forgotten. Something stirred in him after that. Subtle, like the shifting of roots under thawing soil. The kind of change that doesn't announce itself with lightning, but with a slow return of color. That evening, instead of walking straight home after closing, Samuel lingered by the library's front facade. He stared at the worn stone, the fading plaque where his name had once been engraved but was now chipped, barely legible. He reached out, touched it, not in grief, but with a craftsman's eye. The next day, he arrived early, earlier than anyone else. He found a ladder and paint supplies hidden in the janitor's closet and used for years. It took hours to scrape away the grime, to brush fresh paint across the wooden rails of the children's reading nook, to polish the windows until the morning sun shone through without interruption. At first, no one noticed. But then the librarian paused at the counter and blinked. Did someone clean the skylight? He said nothing, just nodded once. Over the following week, Samuel began restoring things. Not because anyone asked, but because he remembered what they were meant to be. He repaired the crooked shelf in the west wing. He replaced the burnt-out bulbs with warm lights. He took down a faded poster and hung a new one, a quote from Carl Jung, quietly pinned above the biography section. The greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of its parents. And then one afternoon, the letter writer came. She was taller now, mid-20s maybe, with a satchel across her shoulder and a measuring tape clipped to her belt. She walked with purpose, but paused at the entrance like he had once done, as if asking the building for permission to remember. Samuel recognized her immediately, not by her face, but by the way she looked at the architecture. Reverently, intimately. When their eyes met, she smiled. "You still work here?" she asked, hesitant. He returned the smile, a little cracked, a little shy. "Apparently." I didn't expect you to write back," she said, flushing. I needed to send that. I wasn't sure if it would even reach you." "It reached me," he said. "More than you know." They sat for a while in the reading nook. She told him about her final year project, a community center in a low-income neighborhood, inspired by libraries and natural light and places that feel like refuge. He told her stories about Caroline, about that first model, about the fights he had with the city over curved walls and soft corners. She asked if she could take his picture. For the presentation, she said, to show the root of the idea. He let her. And for the first time in years, when the camera clicked, he didn't look away. As she left, she paused beneath the plaque. Her fingers brushed the stone reverently. "You should restore this," she said. Samuel looked at the fading letters. "Maybe I already have." He watched her go, the sunlight casting her shadow long and golden across the floor he had once chosen tile by tile. And when he turned back to the shelves, to the books and dust and breath of the building that still somehow remembered him, he didn't feel like a ghost anymore. He felt alive. Remembered. Seen.